Welcome to the third lesson of War and Storytelling in Ukraine. Now, just a quick review before we move on, in case you missed it. The first lesson, I talked about storytelling in war and the historical importance of storytelling in war and all the principles. I outlined all 9 principles we're going to go over. In the second lesson, I talked about principles of storytelling and principles of storytelling from the perspective of the great storytellers of history as defined by Joseph Campbell and the Hero's Journey framework. So the third, fourth, and fifth lesson of this lecture series are going to be on the principles of war. And now that you understand why storytelling is the most important part of warfare, and you understand the principles of great storytelling, now I want to go through the 9 principles of war as I've defined it in the order of importance. And today, the first 3 principles that we're going to go over are all called on information. And the information sphere of warfare is the most important sphere of warfare. And that's why these first 3 principles are more important than anything else. And you're going to think about great battles and offensive operations and raids and defensive operations, but those things are going to be the last principles. The last 3 principles of the 9 are actually the fighting itself, because the story, as you're going to understand more deeply today, and the way that the story is communicated shapes and sets the conditions for success on the battlefield. And before we get to the battlefield, the next lesson number 4, we're going to talk about what actually drives successful battles is intelligence. And as you'll see, the hierarchy is information first, leads to intelligence, which actually is more important in the hierarchy as I define it than the actual battles themselves. So this might seem backwards if you've watched a lot of war movies, or if you're a military officer and all you've ever done is trained at the tactical level on fighting. You think naturally, because it's in the movies, because that's what you've trained for if you're in the military, that's the most important thing. So on information, we're going to talk about 3 principles, the first 3 principles. And these first 3 principles are illustrated by the photograph in front of you on the screen. Now, this is a picture of my old regimental commander in Iraq, Colonel H.R. McMaster, who went on to be Lieutenant General, was the National Security Advisor under President Trump before he got fired by President Trump. And he was widely regarded in the United States Army as one of the greatest officers of the entire generation in terms of both his intellectual abilities. He wrote a PhD thesis on the failures of the Vietnam War as a history professor at West Point, but also his battlefield prowess. He was a Silver Star winner in the Gulf War, destroyed an entire regiment of Iraqi Republican Guard units of T-72 tanks. And he also fought in the Battle of Talafar as a colonel, and I was the adjutant for him during this fighting. So I spent the entire tour in Iraq following him around as basically an observer to history and seeing what he was doing. And one of the most interesting parts of watching Colonel McMaster in battle, I'll never forget a story I'll share with you. Mayor Najim in the middle here, he's actually moved now, Najim Abdullah al-Jabari, he's actually moved with his entire family to the United States. But he was the mayor of Talafar, which was this city in northwestern Iraq that we were fighting over. And I'll never forget the beginning of the Battle of Talafar when we were sitting in this ancient Ottoman castle overlooking this, 2,000 plus year old city with streets so narrow and windy that you couldn't fit armored vehicles around it. And the battle had started, and there were tank explosions, tank gunfire going off, Navy SEAL snipers running around on this castle, shooting down into the area which was basically held by the enemy, as we defined it, the Iraqi Al-Qaeda forces, and helicopter gunships overhead shooting Hellfire missiles down. It was a very loud moment, right? And we're sitting, I'll never forget, sitting in the middle of the office, the mayor's office, in the middle of this castle with this entire battle starting around us. And what are we doing? We're not looking at maps. We're not sitting there figuring out where we're going to move the forces. We're sitting there talking. And I'll never forget this, chai being brought in, refreshments, some candies, and Colonel McMaster, who's a natural warfighter, is sitting there, and you could tell he wants to be out in the fight. In fact, I remember speaking to him before the battle, and he said, hey, we're going to drive our vehicle over here, and we're going to get into the fight this part, because that's where all the great fighting's going to be. And I remember our regimental command sergeant major, William Burns, coming up to him and saying, no, sir, actually, you're not, because we're going to have more important things to do. And what was Colonel McMaster doing during the battle? He was talking to the mayor, who represented the people, which were the center of gravity in this operation. Were the people going to be on our side, the Iraqi army's side, which was supported by the American soldiers, or were they going to be on the side of the insurgents that were actually the people that we were fighting against? The center of gravity was the population, and that's why Colonel McMaster, sitting there in the middle of this battle that's breaking out all around him, talking to the political leadership. And that the other person standing next to him, Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Hickey, was actually the person who started going in and developing that relationship with Mayor Najim, because he was in charge of the town of Talafar until it became a bigger operation. And then Colonel McMaster started taking over that relationship with Mayor Najim, because through him, he could influence the local population. He could form better relationships with the Iraqi army. He could form better relationships with the local police. Sometimes there were questionable loyalties among members of the local police. You weren't quite sure if they were on your side or someone else's side. And I'll never forget that image and how much time we spent during this battle that unfolded over the next month, the entire month of September of 2005, not sitting there with binoculars looking at the battlefield or sitting in the command post monitoring the maps. Yes, there were people doing that. They all worked for the colonel, but the colonel's most important job during this battle was actually dealing with and influencing the leader of this town, which was key to the center of gravity. The most important part of the battlefield is not the piece of land, it's not the front lines, it always ends up being the population. Because whether or not you win in war depends on, do you have the population on your side at the end of it? If you conquer a piece of territory, but you can't keep the population on your side, they're going to kick you out. If you take a piece of territory and the population's not on your side, the only way that you can defeat them, if they're not going to be behind you, is to either kill all of them, which has been done before in history, or try to get them onto your side. And the United States Army in Iraq, because of international global media, and also probably hopefully the morals that guided our foreign policy, killing everyone that was against us and all the collateral damage that would have entailed wasn't going to happen. It wasn't practical. It wasn't something that we could do. So we had to work really, really hard to, as Colonel McMaster used to say, separate the enemy from the local population, get the local population on our side so that we could win the intelligence war, which would then lead to winning the battles that we still had to fight. So this is why information warfare is actually the most important part of warfare. And for a lot of military officers who've been trained, as I was growing up, on how to shoot tanks, how to lead infantry attacks, information warfare is a lot of times this separate thing that maybe the special forces do, or some special unit that gets attached to your unit is specializing in. So it always kind of seems like a sideshow. But the higher you go up in your understanding of warfare, you'll understand this great fighter, Colonel McMaster, who's legendary for his ability to lead troops into combat, firing his weapons, as he did in the Gulf War, actually spent most of his time on the political side of warfare. Because ultimately, war is a political disagreement that turns violent. As Clausewitz, famous war theorist, said, War is politics by other means. It's an argument at a global level that's turned violent. So, the first principle, story, is the most important part of war. If you cannot get the story right, if you cannot rally the people under you to die for a story, what story are you willing to die for? Then nothing else will matter. If you don't have a story that's clear, that's not confusing, that's not against someone's own beliefs, you don't have a chance in winning in war. Eventually, the best story is going to win. And Winston Churchill here on 8 May 1945, giving his victory address on the day that the Germans surrendered in 1945, nobody could have predicted, very few people could have predicted 5 years before that, during the Battle of Britain, that Winston Churchill would be in this position, where not only had England survived, which a lot of people thought England could survive because it's an island nation, but had absolutely destroyed the German nation, the German warfighting machine. Hitler had committed suicide just 8 days before. Berlin had been captured. And it came down to Winston Churchill clearly defining the story in the darkest moment of the battle for Great Britain. And literally in 1940, when the British Army was chased off the fields in France, crossed the English Channel, left all of their equipment in France, lost a lot of their soldiers there. Not all of them, but a good portion of them in terms of killed and wounded. All their equipment gone. They had nothing. But what Winston Churchill understood, as they famously said, his political enemies in Great Britain, he mobilized the English army, or the English language, and sent it into battle. And his speeches over the radio became legendary in terms of their clarity of the story that hadn't yet happened but would happen, which was England would never surrender. They would fight on the beaches, they'd fight on the landing grounds, they'd fight in the streets, they would never give up, and that the United States eventually would get into this war and turn the tide of the war. And the Soviet Union, which had not yet been invaded, joined that team. And when Winston Churchill found out the Soviet Union was invaded, he said, if Hitler invaded hell, I'd give the devil a favorable mention here in the House of Commons. And that's basically what Churchill did when he partnered with Stalin to defeat Hitler. So the story is everything, right? And we're going to talk about that here in detail in terms of why have stories been so powerful in warfare and why have they been defeated? And I want to go through the 3 wars that we've been talking about in this lecture series for context. First of all, World War II, specifically as it relates to Ukraine. Secondly, Iraq, and then finally, the Ukraine conflict, to give you context and compare the stories and why certain stories won out over others. So Hitler's story was very clear for a long time. Hitler first wrote down the story, the blueprint, for what he was going to do in 1923 in prison. After he'd been arrested in the beer hall putsch in Munich, trying to overthrow the Weimar Republic, he sat down and he wrote it out. And he said that Germany was entitled to avenging its loss in World War I, its humiliation. There was a huge sense in the German population that World War I and the peace that followed it was not fair. Germany had received all of the blame for the war, had been saddled with huge reparations, war guilt clause in the Treaty of Versailles, and Hitler tapped into that. He understood the political grievances within his country, and he said, look, I'm going to make us proud again, kind of like you're seeing some strains in American politics, make America great again. This idea of a great power that's been humiliated and has the ability to redeem itself, if you look at the storytelling framework, is one of the most powerful storytelling parts of the storytelling formula that we talked about by Joseph Campbell. This idea of resurrection, rebirth, transformation, getting old greatness back. So he tapped into that and he wrote it down. And he became the most popular politician in Germany and became legally elected as the Chancellor of Germany, and eventually turned that into a dictatorship by 1934. But one of the things that Hitler also wrote down when he talked about this grievances of Germany was this idea of Lebensraum, living space in the East. And unlike Great Britain and France and the United States, which had become imperial powers based on the strength of their navy, Hitler envisioned Germany as an imperial power that was destined to greatness, but unlike using the navy like these other great powers, it was going to use its land army. And to the east was considered its living space. So when we get to why Germany failed in terms of winning over the population in Ukraine and Belarus and the other parts of the Soviet Union, which it viewed as part of its living space, one of the reasons they could not gain the support of the local population, as we'll get to later when we talk about the incidents that spurred the backlash against the Germans as they came in, is because the ideology, the story that Hitler had preached to his population, which he got elected on, which he ruled on, was the Jews are subhuman. They are the cause of all of our evils, and we need to solve that problem. And also the Slavic people to the east, starting in Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, they're Slavs, they're subhumans. They are meant to be slaves to the master race. So the story that Hitler had told himself and his population that they'd bought into, that was the base of his power, had it was deterministic. They had to behave in a certain way. And right before the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, there was a Wehrmacht directive, which basically said from the very highest levels that the general staff of the Wehrmacht said, the rules of land warfare, Geneva Convention, are not to be observed in the East. Okay, and this is a war of annihilation and an epic racial struggle. That came from the top. And there's a lot of people who like to say now, apologists for the German army, that yes, it was just the SS, Hitler's personal bodyguards, and these special SS units that got recruited, and they did all of the atrocities, but that's not true. When you look at the way that the German army behaved writ large in the East, it came from this ideology, this story that the German population had bought into. And this story was very entrenched, and it was pervasive, and it determined the actions of the German army. The intelligence, what they chose to believe about how tough the Soviet Union resistance would actually be, which was they severely underestimated how long the Soviet army would last, and eventually how many troops they needed, how many soldiers they needed to subdue the Soviet Union. Sounds familiar. Overestimating your enemy based on the story you're telling yourself, the intelligence you choose to believe about how well they can fight because they're racially inferior, leads you to invade with not enough soldiers and an unrealistic timeline for subduing that. Does that sound familiar? Okay, that's what happened to the German army, all based on the story. Now, I put on here the Mein Kampf. There was actually a Sputnik news correspondent that said a copy of Mein Kampf was found in the Azov garrison at Mariupol. And that just goes to show you how pervasive to this day, 80 plus years after the fact, the story from a war that most of us, almost none of us were alive during, still governs the war that we're fighting today. These stories do not die. These stories live, and the legends of these stories, the myths, the prejudices from stories from the Second World War are still with us in this current war. And let's talk about Stalin's story, because Stalin is no hero in Ukraine either, but in history, at least for a lot of the population in Ukraine, Stalin is the lesser of two evils. And what Stalin managed to do and it took him 2 weeks to do it, was after the shock of the invasion, Stalin told himself again, sounds like a recent war that just started, there's no way this could happen. There's no way they're going to invade us. We have a peace treaty. There's no way Germany's going to do this. They need all of our oil. This would be crazy for them to invade us. He told himself that. He fired intelligence agents who told him anything differently than he didn't want to hear. Sounds a lot like Ukraine's leadership before the war started. He was in denial, but he finally gave a speech on the 3rd of July, 1941 on the radio, where he embraced a role that he'd never had in the population before, which was calling them sisters and brothers and comrades, and coming down to the level of the people in a much more familiar and, let's call it, intimate way than he'd ever dared do before, because Joseph Stalin before the war was quite ruthless and distant and detached, which a lot of people thought made their regime very weak. But one of the things that Stalin managed to do in the Second World War was reconnect with Russia's past, which really rallied the people, and reconnect the Russian imperial past, and reconnect with the church, which he'd also suppressed before this period. He brought out the old traditions that he knew would unify the people, which were, a lot of it was against the Marxist, Leninist ideology upon which the state was built, and created this nationalistic fusion of the international Marxist ideology and ancient Russian imperial traditions and religious traditions, which managed to turn Stalin into a far more resilient and powerful leader than the Germans ever gave him credit for being able to become. And this was very powerful, and it ended up rallying the Soviet population and winning the war. And for all of those who say, of course, Germany was destined to failure on the Eastern Front, that's not true, because in 1917, the Russian Empire collapsed, and by 1918, the Soviets, who inherited the state after the revolution of October 1917, they gave the Germans basically everything they wanted to stop the war. So the German memory and the Russian memory was that Germany has won before, just 20 years before, and Stalin was not a popular person. He'd done a lot of things, especially in Ukraine, the border regions, Ukraine, Belarus, to lose the support of the local population, but he managed to get it back. And part of that is because, as powerful as Hitler's story was for the Germans, it was completely incompatible to gaining the population's support in the Soviet Union. As bad as Stalin had been, Hitler managed to be worse. And if you look at the same war that's happening, or different war that's happening 80 years later here in Ukraine, the same thing's happening. Ukrainians know that if Russia succeeds, the state is simply not going to exist. Right? They already know the future if they lose. So in Iraq, the United States went in 2003, and the story we were sold, and I was an Army officer at the time and believed it, was we were liberating the Iraqi people. And we went in, the regime toppled within 3 weeks of the invasion, unlike what happened in Ukraine. The United States Army was successful with about 150,000 soldiers in a country of similar size geographically as Ukraine, but not as many people. And what happened there was Saddam was not popular. A lot of the population didn't like him, just like Stalin. In fact, Saddam, interestingly, had a whole library full of books about Stalin. That was his hero. So he was not a popular person. And he got deposed, and people really didn't rise up and fight for Saddam like they did under Stalin. And one of the reasons was the United States, especially in the beginning, was not brutal towards the population. There were people who got killed in the initial invasion because they were at the wrong place at the wrong time, but there was not an overall systematic order from the United States to brutalize the population. So people were willing to give us a chance, but where the United States lost Iraq was in the chaotic months after the invasion. We didn't have enough soldiers in the country to provide security. The electrical grid and all these things that were destroyed were not rebuilt. And there was just chaos. So people started to realize, okay, all of our museums are getting looted. There's no security. There's no police officers on the street anymore. And it started to become chaos. And that's where an insurgency grew up, where people like Abu Musab al-Zakari, who started to lead al-Qaeda in Iraq, was able to come in and build a very strong resistance against the United States Army. And his message was, these are invaders, they're crusaders, just like and especially in countries that don't have a great present, they can see that other countries are a lot richer than them and that they're behind economically. A lot of them love to look back to past glories. And the Arab states, they have past glories, where the Arab states were the most powerful after the period of Muhammad. They were the most powerful states in the world. And they were able to beat the Christian crusaders that came to the Middle East. So he was able to get these ancient ideologies and ancient grievances to get not a huge following, but enough of a following and enough of a, let's call it fear or passive support among the population or large parts of the population, that he was able to operate and cause huge problems for the United States Army. And that was the story from Zarqawi, right? And he told a story that was very powerful, that scared a lot of people into not opposing them, and rallied a small but very diehard core of people who were willing to fight an army much more powerful than them with untraditional means, like suicide bombings, roadside bombs, and a lot of things that caused the United States Army to react, kill innocent civilians, and create more enemies, right? And that was the power of Zarqawi's story. The United States came in, they've invaded our country, it's chaos, they don't care about us, we need to kick them out. Classic story that I think a lot of Ukrainians understand, which is when someone comes into your land, even if they're not brutalizing the population, it's not a pleasant thing. And the United States Army underestimated the resistance they were going to face after the war because they didn't give enough troops, enough money, enough planning to provide for the security and for the well-being so that people's lives became better after they lost a terrible dictator who idolized Stalin. So what happened after that is General Petraeus came in. And General Petraeus was there when I was in my second tour in Iraq after Colonel McMaster had managed to turn things around in the Battle of Talafar. The story that worked in Talafar was the following. Hey, look, we've made mistakes. The United States Army made a lot of mistakes, which means owning up to something that's plainly true to everyone. Not trying to say, hey, you should be thankful that we freed you. Okay, but hey, we came in, we had the best intentions, but we made mistakes. But we're trying to give you our country, we're trying to give you your country back. We don't want to stay here any longer than you want us here. We want Iraqis to take charge of their own security, and we just need you to take control of your communities so that you're not being brutalized by al-Qaeda in Iraq, which even though they say they're fighting the Americans, they're killing a lot of innocent civilians with suicide bombings in marketplaces, with roadside bombs that also wound and kill innocent people. They are actually killing more Iraqi army and police, way more Iraqi army and police, which are your brothers and sisters who are trying to take your country back for you, than Americans are killing anyone else, any civilians. So that was the story that started to become successful in the Battle of Talafar. And General Petraeus ended up taking command of the entire operation in Iraq. Colonel McMaster ended up advising him, and they took the blueprint of what happened in Talafar, which was the first successful counterinsurgency campaign that actually took root in Iraq, and they spread those tactics and, more importantly, that messaging across the country. And I remember coming into Iraq, and as a troop commander who'd just been there about 18 months before when things were not going well, I could feel and sense the difference. And the reason why was General Petraeus was a master storyteller. he would write these memorandums, these messages to the troops, publish them, and we would all hear and see these messages. And we understood exactly what we were doing. We understood that we were no longer trying to kill the terrorists, which was the original mission, which was kill the enemy, destroy the enemy. But the real mission was to secure the local population so that the Iraqi army and police could take control of their own country and we could leave Iraq in a better place than we found it. Because in the first couple of years we were in Iraq, I remember having conversation with commanders, and they would say, we're not here to be a politician, we're not here to run for office, we're here to defeat the enemy. So the entire focus of the American army at the beginning of the war in Iraq, when the occupation started, was to defeat the enemy, which means finding them, capturing them, killing them. But what did that do? It just created a cycle of violence, which created more and more people that were fighting against us, because our focus was not on making Iraq a better place for Iraqis, but it was on killing as many of the enemy as possible. So that story, that clarity of why are you doing what you're doing, which is the story, your mission, became clear and it became understandable, and that guided everything that we did. So let's go before the war here in Ukraine and Putin's story. Last July of 2021, Putin published a 7,000-word essay. I'm going to have all of you read it for your homework. But he published a 7,000-word essay on the Kremlin's website, which I think is still there. It's called On the Historical Unity of the Russian and Ukrainian People. And his argument in this essay was basically a distorted view of history, using things that happened, but putting it in a very Russian-centric focus by saying that Ukraine is not a real state unless it's under Russian domination. Ukraine doesn't have any sovereignty unless it's protected by its big brother Russia. And he goes through and talks about this idea that Ukraine was basically an invention of Lenin when the Soviet Union was created. And he denies the history that Ukraine has as not being real, and its identity and its right to exist. And when this essay was published in 2021, the summer, the analysts that have been studying Ukraine, and I'll talk more about them later at the end of this presentation, alarm bells started to go off, because the messaging, the story that was coming out of the Kremlin at that point was kind of like Hitler's Mein Kampf in 1923. Was basically saying, here's what's going to happen, here's what we're going to do. And he didn't say in particular, we're going to invade Ukraine, but he basically, based on this argument, left us two things to conclude. Either Putin is just all talk, and he's writing an essay for fun, but he has no means to back it up, or this is exactly what he intends to do, which is, before he leaves this earth, before he leaves power in Russia, he's going to settle what he calls the Ukraine issue, the Ukraine question. And this is the scene from his rambling speech on the 24th of February, where Putin basically rambled on and said all these different things that he'd written down, which was a shock to the people of Ukraine as they watched this and as their country was getting invaded. But that's basically the story. Now, the big question has become, are Russians willing to die for this story? And that's the challenge that Putin's had throughout this war, is the low level of motivation among the population for a story that's not very clear to a lot of people. Now, to him, it's crystal clear, and to a lot of hard-right nationalists inside of Russia, it is clear. But one of the big challenges that Russia's having, based on anecdotal evidence from talking to prisoners of war and talking to people who are getting now conscripted, is they don't really understand what they're fighting for. Why are they in Ukraine? Why does Ukraine have to be part of Russia? Now, there are a lot of people who believe that and enthusiastically sign up for and are willing to die for that. But the percentage of people in Russia that buy into that is a lot smaller than the percentage of people in Ukraine that are buying into their story. And this is President Zelensky's story. This is his speech on 19 February 2022 to the Munich Security Conference. And I'll also give you a text of this to read, because what President Zelensky was doing in the speech was the war, according to everyone, was just about to start. And when he flew to the Munich Security Conference, a lot of people were worried, please don't go, your plane might get shut down, you might get stuck out of the country when a war starts. But he thought it was important enough to go to this conference and basically say, look, Ukraine is a canary in the coal mine, and because we have not stopped what's happened to Ukraine in terms of Crimea and the Donbass in the last 8 years, the international order is broken. And he basically went out there and he attempted to shame the world by setting the conditions for, if and when the war started, that two things would happen. First of all, the world would understand that Ukraine in no way provoked or started this war. And secondly, that the reason the war had started was the fault not just of Ukraine, but the entire Western population, the entire Western world that had offered Ukraine security guarantees in 1944, or 1994, in the Budapest Memorandum, which they didn't stand behind in 2014, and the weak or non-existent response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine originally in 2014. And he went there because he knew that the story that he was telling, he not only needed to rally his population, which he was getting ready to do, and probably didn't start to rally the population until right after the war started, because before that he was trying to keep everyone calm to think that the war wouldn't start. But getting the international population, or the international community, specifically Western Europe, which had the wealth, the means, and the interest to back Ukraine, to rally them if the war would start. And these two speeches, or two arguments, as it were, the Munich speech from President Zelensky and Putin's 7,000-word essay, and then his rambling speech when the war started, are the narratives that have given the world the choice. All right, and what President Zelensky has managed to do with his activities before the war started, which, again, a lot of people would argue that he didn't adequately prepare the Ukrainian country financially, militarily, for the war. But by laying out the argument clearly to the world when the war started, he was able to rally global support for Ukraine, specifically Western Europe, NATO, giving support to Ukraine that a lot of people never would have imagined as possible. I mean, if you would have told someone 9 months ago before the war started that Ukraine's going to get invaded by Russia and Ukraine's actually going to survive militarily and not get completely destroyed by the Russian army, and it would be just about to be getting tanks and fighter jets, which is the next weapons transfers Ukraine's waiting on, and it has a real chance to kick the Russian army out of Ukraine, I don't think anyone would have believed that as a story, as a possibility. I don't think President Zelensky believed it. I don't think anyone in the Ukrainian military believed. Now, there might have been some generals who said, yes, we can really defeat the Russian army. But even if Ukraine would have done exactly what it did at those amazing first days of the war in the Battle of Kiev, without international support come middle of April, early May, huge transfers of howitzers, Western ammunition, Ukraine would not have survived. That is clear. No one would argue that point, even the most strident optimist for Ukraine. Without international support, Ukraine would have lost this war 7 or 8 months ago. But President Zelensky managed to lay the foundations for a successful story. And there's two stories here. The story to the local population, to the Ukrainians, to rally them, to get them to be willing to fight and die for this story, and the story for the international population. The West, the collective West, the richest countries in the world, Western Europe, NATO, the European Union, even, especially Eastern European countries aside from Hungary, Japan, Australia, Canada. That's what I mean by the West. Now, in the global South, which hates the United States and therefore reflexively will take whatever side the United States is not on, it's been about a tie. Global South is not enthusiastically behind Russia, but they're not condemning him either. But President Zelensky overall has managed to win the global narrative to this point, and definitely to rally the Ukrainian population much more effectively than the Russian army, the Russian state. Now, principle number 2. So story is everything. It's like the plot of a movie without a great story is not going to work. But principle number 2 is marketing. And what is marketing? Marketing is the use of mass media communication tools to get that story out there to the world. And in World War II, one of the interesting things, everyone knows that Hollywood is the top film industry in the world, but actually in the 20s and 30s, the top film industries actually were coming out of what people still study in film school today, actually are some of the movies that came out of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And that's Dziga Vertov's Man in the Movie Camera, which is a look inside of a worker's paradise. It's kind of almost like a Clockwork Orange type film of Soviet life and how great the world is under a communist utopia, a Leninist, Marxist utopia. And this feeling of progress that the film conveys. And that's still studied in film schools to this day as a masterpiece of cinematography and visual storytelling. And then Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, which was a classic propaganda film which told the story of Hitler's rise in Nazi Germany, is considered another classic. At the beginning of the movie, Hitler descending in an aircraft from the clouds as if the second coming of a deity into the Nuremberg rally. And one of the interesting things about the film industry at that point was it was a national thing to have a film industry. The entire country had to get behind building a good film industry because of the complexity of the equipment. Now, fast forward to today when everyone has a phone in their pocket and they're an Instagram star, just with the tools available on an iPhone. These used to be, the film industry was a national industry, just like the radio industry. And if you look at television after World War II, major government-funded corporations dominated television for a long time. These were instruments of national power that the Germans and Soviets specifically spent a lot of time mastering. The ability to communicate over the radio, the ability to communicate through films and newsreels. And as you go into World War II, one of the things the Germans really mastered through Joseph Goebbels was newsreels. Newsreels to create images of strength that were actually overindulgences of the real strength of Nazi Germany's military forces, of their battlefield prowess. And these newsreels that used to be showed at the beginning of movies in the United States literally would have this chilling effect on whether the Americans wanted to get involved in Europe because of, look at this perceived strength coming out of Nazi Germany because of amazing cinematography that shipped all over the world and played at the beginning of all these movies. And one of the things the Germans famously did at one of their rallies is they would show all their aircraft flying over, and they would literally just loop the footage. So they seemed like they had 5 times as many aircraft as they did in some of these newsreels, but it was visual imagery that Hitler wanted to use to scare the rest of the world from standing up to him. And if you think about this now, in our age, what are the tools of marketing? It's social media, Twitter, Telegram, Instagram, Facebook. all the different social media channels, YouTube. And one of the things Ukraine has done expertly is dominating this information space, especially in the Western world. Now, in the global South, it's a lot more mixed. That's where Russia's having a lot more success, in India, in African countries, and in South America, spreading their version of the truth and what's happening. But in the Western world, where Ukraine needed to win and garner the support of the countries that could afford to, that had the equipment to support them, specifically the United States, Great Britain, and NATO countries, and Eastern European countries, they've won that space. And this is an amazing achievement on Ukraine's part, because for Ukraine, a lot of people thought that Russia was an expert in information warfare, and they were destined to win that fight. But they've completely lost that fight. Now, a quick story about marketing from a tactical level. Now, there's 3 levels of war, and I'm going to go through the different levels of war for each one of these principles. I was a troop commander in charge of 140 people in Iraq in 2008, and I showed you the video in the last lesson of this reconciliation that happened in our area. And one of the amazing things that happened was, in my first tour, I listened to Colonel McMaster tell the story that I believed was the winning formula for winning over the local population, which is, we've made a lot of mistakes. We acknowledge those mistakes, but it's time for us to fix them with your support so that you can take your country back, so that we can leave as soon as possible. And I remember after we first arrived in Iraq in late 2007, we did a raid of the local neighborhood looking for people who were potentially trying to harm my soldiers in the area right around our base. And we did this raid. And after the raid was finished, we were looking for weapons, we were looking for some people. We didn't end up finding what we were looking for, but the soldiers generally behaved well. They didn't mistreat the local population. And there was a local leader of the neighborhood that we were in charge of right around our base, who came to us and said, "Hey, here's a letter. Let me just explain to you how your raid impacted us. We were all supposed to be going to work at the time. We were all late for work. The kids were scared. A list of grievances, right?" And my executive officer at the time, Matt McKee, he was working for me, and he said, "Sir, this guy wrote us a letter. I'm going to write him a letter back. Is that okay?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. Write him a letter. What are you going to say?" And he said, "Well, here's what I think we should say." And he wrote this letter, and he basically said, "Yep, sorry about the timing. We'll try to do better next time. We'll try to work with you better. We'll try and avoid disrupting your lives when we need to look for people. The reason we're doing this is we're trying to keep everyone safe, including you and your families." It was just a very nice response. Let's call it a customer service letter back to the local population. And what was interesting was we didn't think anything of it, or at least I didn't. I actually didn't think it was a bad idea, but I wouldn't have thought it was a great idea worth spending our time on. But one of my leaders decided it was important, and he did it. And this local leader, he was so happy to get this letter that he came back almost with tears in his eyes, and he said, "Thank you so much." And we saw that this simple act of communicating, acknowledging things that could have been done better by our soldiers, acknowledging their own living needs as people living under occupation as they saw it, or let's call it beside us, a foreign body of troops as we were, that we had a good communication with them through that. So my first sergeant, he came back to me afterwards. He was my executive officer, my first sergeant were the 2 senior leaders that worked right under me. And he said, "Sir, you're a really good writer. You used to teach history and all that stuff, and you like to write these memos to the soldiers explaining what we're doing. Why don't you write a letter to the local population? And why don't you tell them what we just told this guy, but think bigger. And I remember saying to myself, well, I'm pretty busy. I got a bunch of meetings. I'm tired. I don't want to write. Like, I'm not here to write. But then I remembered Colonel McMaster, and I remembered him in Talifar and how much time he spent talking to people. And I realized as my own schedule, the reason I was so tired was I was spending all this time talking to people, day after day, sitting down, saying the same exact thing. Hey, we're here. We made mistakes. We're here to make things better so we can go home so you can take your country back. And the Eid festival was coming up, the local, kind of like the Arabic or Muslim version of Christmas, the Eid festival every year. It falls different times due to the lunar calendar. It was coming up. I think it was in November when we were there at the time. And I decided to sit down and write a letter. And I'll include this letter in the homework that I send out for this lesson. But I basically wrote down a 1.5 page letter, the story. Here's why we're here. Okay, here's why we're here in Iraq, and here's how we're going to help you. And here's how we're going to leave. And I sent that out, and I printed it, and then I had my translator who studied English literature, as he called it, English literature, at Baghdad University, and he loved Shakespeare. So this guy was great at English, and he translated my letter into Arabic. So I go to the local mayor, the local police chief, the local police officer, the army officer. I give him that letter, and we're just sitting there, and the police chief and the local leaders, one of them literally has tears in his eyes, and he said, "Thank you for writing this, because nobody's ever explained to us this clearly, the situation, why you're here and why you shouldn't, why we need to be on your side." And they were touched by it because we'd taken the time not only to write them this letter, but put it in their own language. He said, "Is it okay if I make copies of this and distribute it around the town?" I said, "Sure." This is before Facebook. It was 2007, before social media. And this letter gets distributed. They deliver it to all the mosques before Friday prayers. And the local imams are reading this letter to the local population. So it gets broadcast out. Everyone out there gets copies of it, and we give out copies, and then more copies are made. And within, I don't know, probably a week or two, I'm getting so many people coming up to me saying, "Thank you for the letter that you wrote me." And they pull out their own copy of it that they have in their pocket as if I'd written it personally to them. And that letter ended up becoming the turning point in our local campaign to turn the area in our favor. Because after that letter came, we got more and more intelligence, which told us exactly where the people we were fighting were, which saved lives of our soldiers, which saved lives of the local Iraqi population. And it led to that reconciliation where we ended up basically making peace with a huge majority of the people who had been fighting Americans in our local area. And all it was simply taking an argument, taking the story for why we were there, and putting it out there clearly. So that was a tactical level communication of marketing done through the old-fashioned way of physical copies, but it went viral. And I share that story because it was a classic example of the best probably hour and a half I've ever spent in my life, the most productive, in terms of putting something down on paper in terms of the impact of lives saved in my own soldiers, local population, and general fighting was huge. Now, it's not nearly as exciting as a war movie where everyone's shooting each other and everyone else dies on the other side. But I remember after I wrote this letter, what happened was a lot of people started coming in who've been fighting us and were negotiating with us. And I had to pull my soldiers aside and say, "Hey, the reason we're talking to these people that we came over here to fight is because if they can stop fighting and they get on our side, we accomplish our mission, which our mission isn't to kill them. Our mission is to secure the population. So if they stop fighting, by definition, we're accomplishing our mission." So you see how important the story of what you're fighting for is, and how that story determines everything that you do and your communication. So President Zelensky addressing the US Congress, if you think about strategic marketing, the three strategic interactions that President Zelensky has is, first of all, with his people. Every night of this war, as I can tell, I don't think he's missed one, President Zelensky gets on, whether he's bleary-eyed at 2 a.m. in front of his desk, unshaven, he talks to the people, like Churchill did. But Churchill, unlike Zelensky, didn't have social media where it's such a rapid communication cycle. He does it every day. I mean, Churchill used to take, he did a lot of speeches, but not at the pace President Zelensky does. Because President Zelensky needs to maintain almost 100% support for this war in terms of, are people willing to die and sacrifice for their story? This idea of Ukraine. Whether they're out of the country and they're volunteering and sending money back, or they're inside the country volunteering, or they're inside the country running the railways, fixing the electrical grid, or just doing their job. And look, President Zelensky, before the war, 35% of the population thought he'd be a good war leader. So, and I said this in the last class, because he wasn't beating the drum to fight the war, maybe the prior president would have been doing a lot more of that. Maybe the prior president would have made Ukraine look more antagonistic towards Russia. I don't know. You can't tell until you see. Maybe the prior president would have just told Russia, you can have whatever you want. Who knows? But President Zelensky specifically gave this story to the world that Ukraine didn't want to fight, and the world believed it. No one believed that Ukraine was trying to start this war. And that was critical for the sympathy and the support that President Zelensky was able to gain. So his first audience is Ukrainians, and by staying in the country, saying, I'm here, we're not leaving, President Zelensky has managed to maintain 90+% approval and support during the war. And Ukraine has proven that people are willing to voluntarily sign up to die for this story. Enough people so that they don't have to do massive conscription, and people are volunteering, enduring energy blackouts and all kinds of other stuff, missiles, you name it, they're enduring what they need to do to win. But that's not enough for Ukraine to win. Ukraine would not have survived without the second pillar, which is the international support. And this is what President Zelensky spends most of his time on, is strategic communications with international partners, whether he's meeting with people who fly in to see them. Sorry, nobody flies into Ukraine to see them. People who fly into Poland, who get on a train to make that 24-hour plus journey to see President Zelensky. He's made speeches to almost every parliament in the world that will receive him. I don't think there's anyone he hasn't spoken to unless they just haven't invited him. And that is the second part of the strategic communications that Ukraine has to deliver. And the third part is to the Russian people. And President Zelensky, the day the war started, I think the night before the war started, made an address in Russian to the Russian people, asking them why they were going to go to war with him, and creating that doubt, that divisions within Russian society. So you have your communication with the enemy, the storytelling, the battle of the story with the enemy, to undermine the unity of that population. You have the storytelling to the global community to consolidate your alliances, your material support, your financial support, things that Ukraine would not survive without. And then finally, you have the internal communication at the strategic level. And President Zelensky has not been perfect, but he's done a pretty good job on all these things, and Ukraine's still in the fight. And I think anyone before the war who would have said we'd be in the position that we are in 8 months in would not have believed that. And you have to give him credit for that. So let's talk about operational marketing. Now, operations are campaigns. Operations are campaigns that lead to strategic outcomes. So these are usually large military offensives, like the Kherson offensive in the south that's going on right now is an operation. The Izium campaign was an operation. That was a large grouping of forces, typically under the command of some kind of general. Several tens of thousands of troops creates what you call an operation, a campaign, where a series of battles or fights are strung together, supported logistically to create some strategic objective. The strategic objective of the Izium campaign was very critical, was shocking the Russians into an understanding that they were actually losing this war. Conversely, convincing the West that Ukraine actually could win and is winning this war. That's what the Izium offensive was strategically designed to do by Ukraine. And they carried out the information warfare around that offensive masterfully, which was, we're going to attack Kherson. Everyone needs to focus on Kherson. Nothing else is going to happen. But then they ended up attacking in the north, creating a almost complete collapse of the Russian lines along the northern part of the lines. And what happened was, you have these military bloggers in Russia, Igor Girkin being the most prevalent, infamous one of them, who are calling out these military setbacks of the Russian army. And there becomes an awareness, even in the most, now Igor Girkin is not a pro-Ukrainian figure by any stretch. He hates Ukraine, he believes Ukraine has no right to exist, but he's become kind of a cult hero, ironically, among Ukrainians and people in the West. I wouldn't call him a cult hero at all, but some kind of a truth teller that people begrudgingly respect for his ability to tell the truth about what the true state of the war was on the Russian side. And he started very, very early in the information space in a Telegram channel that he controls, calling out the Russian military for its incompetence. When Russia's telling everyone we've got no casualties and Ukraine is going to lose very soon, he was calling that out. And the reason I bring him up is these kind of social media influencers like Arestovich in Ukraine and other people who have, I wouldn't call them strategic impact, actually some of them do have strategic impact. You could even argue that Igor Girkin has strategic impact with his influencing, but these people, these war reporters, these people who go out and deconstruct and report on and tell the truth around what's really happening on the battlefield, who tell the story of these campaigns on our side, on Ukraine's side, but also on Russian side, they play a huge amount of, they have a huge importance on the battlefield because these pictures of Russian positions, Russian vehicles being captured, create a huge global impact in terms of perceptions of success or failure of certain campaigns. And there's a reason Kherson, because I went down there a couple weeks ago, there's a reason why there's an almost complete media blackout down there. Because that fighting is tough. And there's a lot of casualties on both sides. And Ukraine, basically, they know how hard that fighting is and how the information space needs to be controlled down there versus in Izium, which was mobbed with cameras. So the story around campaigns and the marketing, the social media impact and the virality of this creates global impacts, which that created a Russian mobilization, right? And that created a point beyond which Russia cannot return, which is once Putin mobilized, this war is a fight to the death between two countries. That was the strategic impact of the success, some would call it catastrophic success, that Ukraine had in September in Izium and Kharkiv. And then finally, tactical marketing. This is what I talked to you about in my experience, just putting out a letter in our local area of operations. I was a tactical level commander, but that created huge information effects because it was distribution using the mass media, even though it was paper, of a story. And these are when cell phone signals down in actual ground combat roles, you go to the front line, your cell phone's not going to work. That in Kherson, they're going back to old school, almost World War II level propaganda at the tactical level of leaflets. intimidating collaborators in the local area, warning the local population on both sides. Russians and Ukrainians are doing it. This basically offering, I think, 500,000 hryvnias reward for killing the local Russian-appointed administrator of Kherson. So at the tactical level, these things are important. The messaging to the local population, to the enemy soldiers, is very important. And then principle number 3 is sales. Now, Churchill was the master communicator of the alliance. He was the master storyteller. He got the story right. He was able to communicate like nobody else on radio. But the master of sales in the alliance was actually Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And what Franklin Roosevelt managed to do was keep together an alliance of 3 very unlikely bedfellows. The Russians, or Soviet Union, and the British famously had always fought each other in great power competitions, had been allies in World War II, and then the British came into the Soviet Union during the Russian Revolution and actually tried to defeat the Soviets by supporting white Russian elements that ended up losing, and Joseph Stalin, right? So keeping all these people together, interpersonally influencing someone. Marketing is mass media distribution of a message. Sales is interpersonal influence, diplomacy. Okay, and it happens at every level. And sales is how people get things done in war. Commanders, there's a great book called To Sell is Human by Daniel Pink, where he talks about the profession of sales, and most people think, oh, that's for slimy salespeople that go out and sell for a living. But actually, he points out in the book, what gets people in your life to do something that you want them to do, and selling is obviously a measure of that in business. But he makes the point that all of us are in sales. If you get married or you don't get married, that's because you sell well or you don't, right? If you get your children to buy into a certain way of thinking or whatever growing up, or they rebel against it, that's based on your ability to sell something to them, sell a story to them. President Zelensky interacting with President Biden is his ability to sell whether Ukraine should get support from the United States. So Colonel McMaster, this is him in Iraq, I remember walking around with him to all the soldiers, and I would drive him around and he'd get out and he'd speak to a group of soldiers. And you know what was so annoying about that? Because I followed him everywhere, is he would get out and he'd say the same thing to everyone. And he'd say the same thing, and I could almost mouth what he was going to say before he said it, because he was so predictable with his messaging. And he used to say to me, he said, Sam, being a commander is like being a politician. You need to get out there, and your soldiers need to be crystal clear on what they're doing and why they're fighting. And they need to see you and hear from you constantly the same thing. And if you repeat it over and over and over again, they will start to get the message. And you don't just sell your soldiers, you also sell the enemy that you're going to win, that you can sell the enemy that they should surrender. And you can do that through marketing too. Marketing, the Armed Forces of Ukraine has some great marketing videos trying to convince the Russians to surrender, but you can also do that on an interpersonal level. So you're selling your soldiers on the story. You're selling the enemy on why you're going to win and they need to give up, negotiate, give up. And then you're selling your partners, just like President Zelensky does in all these speeches, one-on-one, behind closed doors, a Zoom, however he does it, on why to do it, why to support. So sales is just like marketing in terms of conveying a story, but it's done in an interpersonal way. Usually in person, but a lot of times now on Zoom, depending on how you do it. And it's incredibly powerful and important to get this right. And Colonel McMaster, this is him with one of his battalion commanders, Colonel Chris Gibson, who eventually went into politics. He became U.S. congressman. And Chris Gibson would say McMaster was an amazing commander because he paid a lot of attention to his commanders and he sold them on the vision of what they're doing and why it was important. So this is a picture of President Zelensky and President Biden on 1 September 2021. So this is after Putin's letter. I actually know someone who briefed the National Security Council in the White House, and they warned President Biden's staff in the summer after Putin put that out. They said Ukraine is going to become a problem. So one of the reasons why President Biden invited President Zelensky to the White House, which never happened under Trump, was they saw what was coming and they wanted to convey their support for Ukraine. Now, President Zelensky, whether he listened to it or didn't tell the Ukrainian people what was coming, he still started to get a sense at this point what was going to happen. And there's a fascinating story that just came out in the media where it was leaked that in June, after a big aid package to Ukraine, President Zelensky got on the phone and he was asking President Biden for more, even after he'd just gotten $1 billion, and President Biden lost his temper on him and really blew up and said, hey, this is politically difficult. This is expensive for America. You need to be thankful. And right after that speech, or let's call it personal sales interaction with President Biden, President Zelensky actually made a specific effort in his public speeches to thank the United States for their aid. And you notice that's been a recurring theme now in his marketing that he's been giving out to the public, which is helping him with his sales. And President Biden has been very strong. I mean, no one, I think, could have predicted the level of support that the United States would have given Ukraine. And a lot of that has just been this constant working of that relationship between President Zelensky. And remember, he has to do this with the European Union. He has to do this with the Chancellor of Germany, people that haven't been that supportive. It's the constant back and forth. The president of Germany finally, 8 months into the war, just visits Ukraine. Because the beginning of the war, when he wanted to visit, Ukraine actually said, no, you're not welcome. There was a lot of problems with the German relationship and the Ukrainian relationship at the beginning of the war. And that's still a big problem in terms of getting main battle tanks, which Ukrainians clearly want German tanks. The Germans aren't willing to give those to Ukraine without other countries also providing similar heavy weapons. So that's strategic sales. Again, strategic sales can be towards your opponent. If President Zelensky ever sits down with President Putin, that's strategic sales 101. That was them in 2019, last time they met in person. That's the situation. And then strategic selling, that's one-on-one interactions with members of the government, members of the Ukrainian population. Anytime President Zelensky has an interaction with someone, the in-person effect of one-on-one attention, responsive communication is incredibly powerful. The more you can have those one-on-one interactions, small group interactions, where it's not just him speaking to some blank media slate, but it's interactive, the more, sales is so powerful. That's why interpersonal for leaders, the more you do it, that's why people go out and campaign on the campaign trail and meet people in politics. Because it is the most effective thing. You can't scale it like marketing. President Zelensky can't shake hands with 40 million Ukrainians. But if you meet the right people, the key people, all the way up and down the levels of society, the word spreads. And that's why sales is so important. So operational sales, this is General Syrski in the Battle of Kiev visiting soldiers at the defense, soldiers in the army that were defending between Irpin and the northern part of Kiev. And General Syrski is actually in Izium, the same thing happened. He gets right out there at the beginning of the offensive and he's visiting soldiers. And generals getting out there and visiting soldiers in the battle is one of the most dynamic things that you can do. President Zelensky did the same thing, going up and visiting Izium to inspire those troops who are in the middle of the fight. after General Sirski had already been out there, they brought President Zelensky out. That personal level of putting yourself in danger and selling to the soldiers, what do you think that did for their motivation in terms of, okay, I'm going to go run to the next town and risk my life? That has a huge effect on the battlefield. So that can change a battle, is the higher level person going down, one-on-one meeting with people, and then you have marketing of that, footage of that gets out. So that interaction where, this person's in danger and they're really important, and that doesn't make the fact that the soldiers on the lower level are in far more danger for a far greater period of time. But given the importance that they have, they're willing to put themselves out there. That's a sales effort for the people who visit them in person. They'll never forget that experience the rest of their life. But then you create marketing around it. You bring the camera crews, you create global media events. You see that interaction between sales and marketing. And then finally, tactical level sales. This is a good friend of Yuri and I who unfortunately passed away. He got killed on the 11th of May fighting in Kharkiv. And he was a platoon leader, right? And he actually made some videos that he posted on Facebook right before he was killed, just explaining the fighting that they were going through. And one of the things that I think is so underappreciated in war is I signed up for the United States Army because I wanted to serve my country. That was a love of country thing, that you sign up for the Army. I wanted to go to the Iraq War because I bought my president's story around the Iraq War. He did a good job selling it. But once we were in Iraq, and the reasons why we'd gone to war were no longer relevant because they didn't find weapons of mass destruction, and a lot of things had changed, that didn't mean that I didn't want to go there and do my job. And the reason why is great leadership at the tactical level. Colonel McMaster was so good at selling and leading people at the leadership level, and my commander, the people we were working under, that people will sign up for the Army and they'll go off and they'll enlist in the Army to serve their country, but that's not what makes you fight. What makes you fight is really inspiring leaders, and Dennis was one of those leaders. His soldiers would follow him anywhere because he understood the story of Ukraine, and he was able to every day explain what they were fighting for and get them to continue fighting. But why people fight and risk their lives and literally die is because of each other and great leaders. And that's not automatic in units. When the Russians bring in a bunch of people who don't know each other and send them out to the front line, that's why they're losing so many people right now on the battlefield. Nobody knows each other. Nobody cares about each other. And I'm not saying, and this is very, very important for you to understand, that's not happening all over the Russian army. They would have lost if they were that bad at this point. But it's not as prominent in the Russian army as the Ukrainian military. And it's not perfect in the Ukrainian military either. There are bad leaders who, even though someone signed up to defend Ukraine, if your leader treats you poorly, doesn't respect you, doesn't explain to you what you're doing, doesn't give you food, weapons, ammunition, you're going to lose your will to fight. But the ability to have leaders who inspire people with their example to put themselves in danger, explain what's going on, risk their lives, die literally for their soldiers, is what can, Napoleon used to say, moral to the material is like 3 times. It can multiply by 3x the power of your fighting force, the moral advantage. And that's really something to understand. At the tactical level, people fight and die not for country, but for each other and for leaders who inspire them. And again, those tactical leaders can convince the population to support them, to give them intelligence. Ukraine should be winning on that front because you're fighting in your own country. But Russian leaders can win on that front too by getting collaborators on their side. So you're explaining to your soldiers why to fight, the local population why to support you versus someone else. And that's really important for the tactical leader right there, because local people can give intelligence that will get you killed. And then finally, it's about, getting that message out there to everyone like Dennis, he would film it, and that creates videos, it creates marketing that can have global impact. I mean, his story, because he got a message out there and he inspired a lot of people, the stories like the people you're going to write about create these legends that become much bigger than just someone who died that no one hears about. And that's going to be the future of Ukraine, is these stories of these people that died, that gave up everything. Is if you can make their story mean something, then it's not for nothing. Even after they die, several decades after they die, it can mean everything. And that's really why this stuff is so important, is when people sacrifice everything. The reason why Ukrainians, I believe, are fighting so hard is they see what happens for someone like Dennis, and there's a street that's hopefully going to be renamed after him very soon. And they'll die for that. They'll die to live forever through the story they create. And that's really important for the success in war, is people will, I remember writing awards for my soldiers who'd risked their lives in combat. I remember seeing awards of Americans that Colonel McMaster had to sign who'd been killed in combat. But we took so much time writing down the story of what they did that they live forever through that award and the story of what they did. And that's really, because war is so bad, it's so horrible to lose so many great people like Dennis, just thousands across the country, tens of thousands of people. The only way to make it worth it, to make this country survive and thrive in the future, is through the stories. And that is the big thing that we need to take out of this. And the Ukrainians, that is your advantage. The Russians are doing this too. Don't think they're not doing this, and don't think they're not good at this. They would have lost by now. So the last thing is the strategic corporal. This is a picture of a soldier in the American Army, Lindy England, who caused more American deaths than probably anyone else. These pictures created so much rage in the patriarchal Iraqi Arabic society. Men being humiliated, dragged around naked on leashes, was far more infuriating to Iraqis than just people getting killed. And this created, when this scandal came out, such a backlash against Americans. It caused probably thousands of casualties on the American side. And I talked about this before. The American government was so insistent to the news organization, you guys can't put out this story, it's going to get us killed. But the news organization did it anyway. But I think it probably saved the American army in Iraq, because it caused the command and the leadership to absolutely make sure stuff like this didn't happen systematically. That this cancer didn't grow in our system where prisoner mistreatment became endemic. Because if they would have swept that under the rug, people would have done more, and they would have done more. And these things, even though the thing wouldn't have gotten out there, the stories, the sales incidents of these things happening, people like this getting released, telling these stories, would have become more and more, and it would have grown into something much worse. And that's what happened in Babin Yar, right here in Kiev. That was Stalin's salvation. If it wasn't for the Germans being far worse than Stalin in terms of their treatment of the local population, and that's relative, some people would argue whether it was far worse or a little bit worse, but killing 33,000 people in 2 days was not a great idea from a strategic perspective. So ultimately, sales is not just what you say, but it's what you do. It's how you act. Because the stories of these atrocities get out there. And they create this thing, like we see after Bucha, point of no return. There's been no meaningful negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians since that happened. Because the people won't allow it. President Zelensky, even if he wanted to, cannot negotiate with Russia right now. So, Borderlands Foundation, I talked about this last week. Our mission here is to help you tell stories of the people the heroes of this war, whether they're living or not. And I just want to invite you again, those of you in this class, that is your main project, that is the main criteria for this course, and create those stories. And this is actually a trip I organized with some top analysts, Michael Kaufman and Ryan Evans from War on the Rocks, and Konrad Muzyka, to visit with the defense minister of Ukraine a couple weeks ago, and we filmed that. So all of that is available for you if you want to watch this. And one of the reasons why I brought these analysts over here was analysts are critical to the storytelling of the war because they actually are not reporters, but they are people that reporters go to, and they ask reporters what they think of actually what's going on. They're kind of like the Igor Gherkins of our side, where they're the real-time truth tellers, and a lot of times they tell us things that we might not want to hear, like Ukraine's not as 10 foot tall, and they're not winning as bad as we all wish they were. And they're certainly not like Igor Gherkins. They've not done war crimes and horrible things like them. But sometimes people get upset that analysts don't say how great Ukraine is. They just say, here's what's happening, here's the good and the bad. But they're the people that policymakers in America listen to on podcasts, or the people that people really believe the most in terms of their ability to objectively call out what's really going on in the war. And that's why it was so important. So do watch that lesson, that bonus lesson, or that class that we filmed a couple weeks ago at the Kiev Independent, and see what they said about the way the war unfolded before the war, since the war started, and what might be happening. So this is one of the things we're doing at the Borderlands Foundation, is organizing trips of people who need to come to Ukraine and see what's going on. We took them out to the front lines. We had them meet with commanders here in Kiev and at the front lines, and with the Secretary of, or Minister of Defense of Ukraine. All right, so thanks again. That's just a little bit more on the Borderlands Foundation. Reminder for all of you to do your stories, and we'll see you in the next lesson.